Good morning, afternoon, and evening, and welcome to today's webinar on energizing financial capacity for multilateral development banks, hosted by the Boston University Global Development Policy Center. The Boston University Global Development Policy Center is a university-wide research center that works to advance policy-oriented research for financial stability, human well-being, and environmental sustainability across the globe. My name is Tim Herschel-Burns, Policy Liaison with the Global Economic Governance Initiative at the GDP Center. This webinar takes place in the context of a huge need for affordable and high-quality development finance. The global community is running out of time and falling behind on financing shared climate and development goals. The United Nations warns that 85% of the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals are either off track, stagnant, or regressing. Climate action is lagging behind the levels needed to meet the Paris Agreement. But even though finance is needed to accelerate action and prevent the enormous economic and social costs of failure on global goals, a number of financing trends are actually going in the opposite direction. Debt servicing costs are at record highs, and a number of countries are cutting official development assistance. Multilateral development banks, or MDBs, have a central role to play in raising ambition to get the international community back on track. MDB's financial model offers unique advantages, allowing them to offer finance on better terms than developing countries could typically access on the market, and MDBs also provide significantly more finance than shareholding countries put in. But for MDBs to be able to fulfill their potential, they will need to have the necessary policies and processes in place to align their financing with development and climate goals. A new report by the GDP Center finds that while MDBs have made important strides towards increasing their lending headroom, more ambition will be necessary to achieve development and climate goals in a timely and affordable manner. This report was commissioned by the Brazilian presidency to the G20 as an input to the G20 roadmap towards better, bigger, and more effective MDBs. And this roadmap was endorsed by G20 leaders in November. To discuss today, I'm joined by two of the report's authors, Kevin Gallagher and Marina Zucker-Marquez. Kevin Gallagher is the inaugural director of the GDP Center, and he served as lead expert on multilateral development bank reform to the Brazilian presidency of the G20. Marina Zucker-Marquez is a senior academic researcher with the Global Economic Governance Initiative at the GDP Center, and she was co-chair for the Brazil T20 Task Force 3 on reforming the international financial architecture. So I'll ask the researchers to give us a brief overview of the report and its findings, and then we'll move into a conversation. So take it away.
It was a great honor to work with the Brazilian presidency, the G20, on the MDB reform package, especially on the bigger pillar. I'm going to present our report, Energizing MDB Financing Capacity, Identifying and Filling Gaps to Raise Ambition for the 2030 Agenda. I'll be presenting that with Dr. Marina Zucker-Marquez, but I should acknowledge that Drs. Rishikesh Rambandari and Dr. Natalie Marins were also co-authors of this, as well as a number of other folks that we mentioned in the acknowledgements. Next slide, please. It's important to just start with what's in the roadmap with respect to the bigger pillar. There's 3 recommendations in the roadmap on making the system bigger. Recommendation number 7 is to continue the ambitious CAF review implementation and review progress periodically over time. Recommendation number 8 is to explore general principles for reviews of the alignment of MDB resources and strategies, with the view to help countries achieve their sustainable development goals, as well to address global and regional challenges while respecting the mandate of each institution. This is really what's being called resource needs reviews, where MDBs are called on to examine the extent to which they have the proper financing to meet the strategic objectives of their boards and the global challenges that are mounting among us. And the last recommendation, recommendation number 9 on the bigger pillar, is to develop and support innovative financial instruments, especially hybrid capital, but also portfolio guarantee mechanisms. Next slide, please. So we have 4 key messages coming out of our report. Number 1, as Tim alluded to, MDBs have made some significant strides in increasing their financial capacity over the past few years. We identified $25 billion in new paid-in capital has been approved, and almost $400 billion in capital adequacy measures. However, core message of this report is that the MDBs are not on a path to meet even the lowest bound projections of financing needs to meet shareholder objectives and global challenges. Lending needs need to at least triple, and the cost of capital needs to come significantly down in order to avoid the cost of inaction. Our third core message is that MDBs lack an evidence-based process to review the extent to which they have the financial capacity to meet capital needs and fill the gaps that are identified. And there's a key role for the G20 to play by endorsing the need for these reviews. The G20 needs to coordinate a set of principles and metrics and processes to ensure that such reviews are conducted in a uniform and timely manner, and that once gaps are identified, that they're subsequently met to meet global challenges. Next slide, please. What we're really pushing for here are to be able to meet our SDGs and Paris goals, not just to meet lofty charitable goals, but these investments and a reform of the MDB system will allow countries in the global south to have new growth trajectories, have more resilience, and most importantly, avoid the huge costs of inaction. It's really important that all of these reform packages be done concurrently. When it comes to the bigger pillar that we worked on, that means working on CAF through hybrid capital and balance sheet optimization, while at the same time increasing the levels of new capital, at the same time trying to improve private capital mobilization and domestic resource mobilization. We cannot do this sequentially. We have to be doing it concurrently. In fact, as you'll see in a moment, if we do it concurrently, the size of the amount of capital increases that will be needed across the system will be significantly lower than if we wait. Next slide, please. One of the things that our group did under the auspices of Christopher Humphrey from ODI Global was survey and work with all the MDBs to examine the extent to which they've been implementing the CAF adequacy measures coming out of the Italian presidency. And as we alluded to, there's been some real movement across the MDB system, increasing the amount of lending upwards to about $400 billion in the next 10 years. Next slide, please. However, when you add it all up, MDB lending is just about 0.5% of GDP, and private capital mobilization is not very strong. If you look on the left-hand side here, you can see that the amount of lending that the system has been able to provide is hardly larger than what was happening in the 1970s, despite the fact of a skyrocketing level of global challenges. And while the MDBs have been trying to mobilize private capital, as you can see here on the right, they haven't been able to have much of a multiplier effect at all, and the amount hasn't gone up since 2016. And in other venues, sometimes this has been causing debt distress in many of the emerging market and developing countries. With the estimates from the CAF review that Chris Humphrey did, Dr. Zucker Marquez led our team's effort in putting together some new projections on what the capital needs across the system might be. And I hand it over to her to present some of those slides.
Thank you, Kevin. Our estimations for the MDB system lending capital needs rely on 5 steps. First, we established the lending targets based on a literature, and we adopted the lower bound in this literature. And we considered 2 main scenarios. One where the cost of capital is the same as before the COVID period, and one where interest rate could be higher for longer, and then volume of lending we need to adapt it for the new market conditions. Second, we incorporated the MDB report CAF review, which Kevin just mentioned, by each MDB, how much they have implemented, how much they expect to increase lending capacity based on the CAF review. The third step was to add a constitutionality component for the lending of MDBs coming forward. We estimated how much additional capital would be needed for MDBs to reduce their lending cost by 1%. The fourth step was to adjust the increase in MDB portfolio risk. We did an estimation that the MDB new lending when we increase the lending portfolio, this could increase up to 10% of new risks. So we adjusted capital needs based on this. And finally, our last step was to adjust based on the 4 steps that we taken earlier, how much would be needed in new capital needs to meet the financial targets of our economy without triggering any downgrades in MDB credit ratings, and also maintaining an adequate buffer. So we wanted to guarantee that MDBs continue to be solid institutions, but also they can meet the economic and social goals of our economy. So our estimations, as you can see here, we identified that MDBs is far from the targets, even of the low bond in our low bonding lending needs in our in the literature. The yellow line shows what is the current trajectory of lending of MDBs as a system if they continue the same path as they are today. The light blue line shows that the lending trajectory that MDBs will need to provide if the economy returns to a lower interest rate similar to the pre-COVID. And the dark blue line shows what is the system MDB needs in case the economic system has higher interest rate. Our idea is that if higher interest rate is on the market, it means that MDBs needs to compensate to create an average cost of capital to developing countries that is below their growth rate, hence providing forthcoming debt sustainability. So this is the result of our estimation for the MDB capital needs in the system. I will not go into detail, but it's important to highlight here is that we identified if the MDBs continue in the current trajectory of CAF implementation and risk appetite, lending new capital increase can go up to 500 to 250 billion, more or less, in the next 5 years. This in terms of the size of government revenue is not much, but in fact, as Kevin mentioned, if capital increase is done concurrently with more capital CAF implementations that is more more risk appetite, but is still maintaining solid approach. So during more concurrently, CAF review with implementation can reduce the cost of capital for MDBs and this cost will be just 0.03% of the government revenues in a yearly subscription of 7 years. So compared to the cost of inaction, this is very small, but it could generate very important lending volumes going forward. So now I will pass to Kevin to discuss a little bit of how to going forward with towards resources needs review.
The Brazilian presidency worked with us to do interviews with all of the MDBs across the system to gather some of the numbers and estimates that went into what Dr. Zucker Marquez just put through. And then we also examined the extent to which the MDBs have systems in place to regularly review the extent to which they can meet shareholder objectives and global challenges through their boards in an evidence-based process. And unfortunately, we're a bit surprised to find that not one MDB has that kind of capacity or any of those kinds of evidence-based approaches. However, there were 5 MDBs that have the elements of what we think could be a methodology and an approach that moves forward. The African Development Bank really does a significant review of the needs in the group of members based on a number of different criteria, and recently had a capital increase. The Inter-American Development Bank's private arm perhaps is the most innovative in having the elements of what might be needed. First, they looked and saw what their overall needs might be. Then they asked themselves to what extent can private capital mobilization, efficiency measures within the bank, balance sheet optimization get them to that need. And then the delta was the amount of capital increase that had to happen. But by and large, across the system, there is no significant evidence-based review process across the system yet. Next slide, please. So recommendation number 8 in the roadmap recommends that these resource needs reviews get done. And perhaps the most important thing for South Africa and beyond is to establish a set of common principles and metrics so that when each bank is doing a review, that they can be compared and summed by the G20 to see if they are acting as a system to meet our global challenges. We have some recommendations for what some of the common principles and metrics could look like. Number 1, they should be conducted by MDBs, but enabled and monitored by the G20. Two, that they should be both science and evidence-based with common metrics across each MDB. Three, like the IDB did, they should consider a broad suite of financial measures. It shouldn't only be looking at what the needs are and thinking about increases in capital. We should also be thinking about different kinds of balance sheet optimization, hybrid capital, new capital, private capital mobilization, et cetera. Number four, to consider collaborating with other MDBs, to consider how certain capital needs can be achieved as a collective. And five, to take into account the absorptive capacity and debt sustainability of the borrowing members, which is why we did this higher for longer scenario. Next slide, please. There's a really important role. Could you go back one, please? There's a really important role for the G20 moving forward. The roadmap requires that each MDB go and do these resource reviews, but we have to act as a system, and the G20 can play that intermediary role to survey the extent to which it all adds up as a system. So it's important for the G20 to facilitate and agree upon a common method and reporting template for identifying new financing needs. Two, to track progress, the way we did with Chris Humphrey on the CAF. The table that we showed you earlier was a great example of a common metric on CAF implementation and a reporting template, so the G20 could add up the extent to which we're meeting these needs. Number three, an analysis of the ability of the MDBs to meet these goals as a system. So after we get a common method and we can track progress, if we're not meeting the system, the G20 is the only one that can really look at the system as a whole, and therefore then make recommendations to members on where and how to achieve any deltas that happen. And finally, to report on advances made to G20 finance ministers on a regular basis. Next slide. That's a quick overview of a 54-page report and lots of deliberations with the MDBs and the Brazilian presidency over the course of a year. And it was really fulfilling. And there's a lot that needs to be done moving forward, but the G20 has outlined a roadmap for what that looks like.
Yeah, thanks so much, Kevin and Marina, for that really rich presentation. And there is so much in this report, both from the methodology, but also more of the nitty gritty. So I'd certainly recommend people read through that report, which can be found on our website. So you both started to talk about the relationship between new capital injections into the MDBs and capital adequacy reforms. The capital adequacy reforms have moved quicker at the MDBs, whereas new capital discussions on new capital have been a little slower. And I was curious if you could talk a little bit more about the relationship between those two.
Well, sure. Let's first be clear about what the difference between each of them are. So the capital adequacy measures are broadly different ways to use your existing balance sheet more efficiently. And as we estimate for the bigger pillar, they have done a number of these measures that add up to about $400 billion total over the next 10 years. That can be from changing equity loan ratios, increasing hybrid capital, and a number of different things. New capital is what sources of how much new capital do you need in the balance sheet to be able to expand the amount of lending that you have. There's been real momentum. It's basically picking all the low-hanging fruit in terms of CAF, but only about $25 billion in terms of new capital injections. We recommend that there's more ambition on CAF measures. We especially see increases in hybrid capital being important. A key milestone earlier this year was the International Monetary Fund sanctioning the use of special drawing rights as hybrid capital. And there are currently proposals by the Inter-American Development Bank and the African Development Bank to be able to deploy hybrid capital in that way. It's really important that in 2025, that both of those proposals come to fruition. Our center, Dr. Zekar Marquez and myself have written a paper for a proposal for something that we call sustainable futures bonds. These are bonds where central banks can purchase bonds from MDBs and hold them into perpetuity as equity. So families of things like that are new capital injections through paid-in capital by members are all key and important to have on the table. But what we also show is that can only take us so far. And the more you just do capital adequacy work, the more risk you put on the balance sheet. And so it's really important to concurrently add new capital while you're doing capital adequacy measures. That allows much more expansion of the balance sheet. It necessitates much less new capital, and very importantly, it preserves the credit ratings of the MDBs, and that's really the golden core of their business model.
Thanks so much for that. You know, and for especially the new capital pieces, I think policymakers can sometimes look at that and get fixated on the cost. Marina, you drew out the ways that those capital needs can differ depending on the policy mix that MDBs use, and also the small share of government revenues that new capital increases would make up. But I also think it's important to think about the costs of inaction. And I'm curious if you could talk a little more about what would happen if MDBs just continue on a business as usual trajectory.
Thank you, Tim. This is a very good question. So there are, studies, academic studies and policy studies showing that if we continue in the current trajectory of emissions and global warming, for every 1% increase in the global temperature, we can see a decline in GDP of 12%. And this is not to mention in the foregone opportunity of bringing people out of poverty, bringing development for more people. So investing what is needed is fundamental. So when we see the projections, the cost of actually putting more capital in the MDBs and allowing them to triple the volume lending is very small compared to this cost, not only in GDP, but human lives and foregone opportunity to invest in where is needed. Our estimation shows that with just 0.03% of global government revenue, we could put MDBs in a foot which is solid, and also them allow to invest in key social priorities, and not only to reach the goals until 2030, but after that, because the volume that they will have in their balance sheet will allow them to continue lending to where is global priority looking forward after 2030, and also bringing more, stimulating private capital and not only investing directly, but creating, a symbiotic relationship with the private sector. So, doing that now is not only comparatively cheap, but it's going to can yield positive results going forward.
Thanks so much, Marina, and nice to find an optimistic note there. So, yeah, in the presentation discussion, I think there have been some really important points raised about the need to properly equip MDBs while making them better at the same time, and the need for evidence-based processes for determining MDBs' resource needs. There was a really important point Kevin made about new capital and further capital adequacy reforms needing to happen concurrently. Marina's point there about the cost of inaction were really important, and I think the next year is a huge opportunity to make progress, especially under the South African G20 presidency, and a key step there will be establishing principles for resource needs reviews and really getting those processes going. I'd encourage everyone to read the full report, which has so much great material in there. And a sincere thank you to Kevin and Marina for sharing their thoughts with us. And thanks to everyone for watching. To receive further updates on future events or research from the GDP Center, you can subscribe to our newsletter at gdpcenter.org/gdpc-subscribe. Thanks so much. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.